husband's parents excluded me from their family for years. Now I'm doing the exact same thing. When I married Daniel, his parents made it clear I wasn't what they'd hoped for. His mother, Linda, would introduce me as Daniel's wife, never by my name, never as her daughter-in-law. His father, Robert, would leave the room when I entered, saying he needed air. At family dinners, they'd set my place at the far end of the table, away from everyone else, with mismatched plates while everyone else had the good china. They'd plan family vacations and tell Daniel about them the day before, saying they assumed I'd be too busy to come. Every Christmas, they'd give Daniel expensive gifts and hand me generic candles or bath sets with the price tag still on, showing they came from the clearance rack. They'd take hundreds of photos at family events but crop me out before posting them. When I got pregnant with our first child, Linda said she hoped the baby looked like Daniel's side because their features were more refined. Robert asked if we were sure the baby was Daniel's, right in front of everyone at Easter dinner. When our son Ben was born, they visited once, complained he didn't look like Daniel enough, and left after 10 minutes. They missed his first birthday because they scheduled a cruise that week, knowing the date months in advance. For our daughter Amy's birth, they didn't even come to the hospital. They sent Daniel a congratulations text, but nothing to me. Every milestone the kids had, they were absent. They'd visit Daniel's brother Kyle, who lived 20 minutes from us, and not even tell us they were in town. I'd find out from Kyle's wife posting photos with them. When we bought our first house, they refused to come see it, saying it was too far even though it was closer to them than our apartment had been. When Daniel got promoted, they threw a party and didn't invite me, saying it was just for blood family. When I graduated with my master's degree after years of night school, they didn't acknowledge it. Daniel would make excuses, saying they were set in their ways, they'd come around, they just needed time. 10 years of time apparently wasn't enough. They'd call Daniel to complain about me, saying I kept the kids from them when they'd never once asked to see them. They'd tell relatives I was cold and unfriendly when I'd spent years trying to connect with them. They'd send birthday cards to Daniel and the kids, but never to me, even though Daniel reminded them every year. At family reunions, they'd introduce everyone else, then gesture vaguely in my direction saying, "And Daniel's here too," as if I was just an attachment to him. Then last year, Robert lost his job at 61. They'd been living beyond their means for decades, assuming Robert would work forever. They had no savings, huge debts, and were about to lose their house. Linda called Daniel crying, saying they needed help. They wanted to move in with us temporarily while they figured things out. Daniel felt obligated and asked me to consider it. I said yes, but I had conditions. They moved in on a Tuesday. I showed them to the smallest bedroom at the back of the house, the one with no closet that we'd been using for storage. Linda asked about the guest suite upstairs, and I said that was for welcomed guests. I gave them mismatched sheets and towels from the donation pile, saying the good linens were for family. At dinner that first night, I set their plates at the TV trays in the living room while we ate at the dining table. Robert asked why they couldn't join us, and I said the table was for immediate family. Linda started to protest, and I reminded her of 10 years of holiday dinners where I'd eaten alone at the end of their table. For Ben's school play, I told them about it an hour before, saying I assumed they'd be too busy to come. When they scrambled to get ready, I said actually the car was full and they'd have to find their own way. They missed it, just like they'd missed every other event in his life. Amy's dance recital, I didn't tell them at all. When they asked why, I said I didn't think they'd be interested since they'd never shown interest before. I started planning a family vacation and booked everything without telling them. When Linda saw me packing, I said it was just for immediate family, and I'd assumed they'd be too busy anyway. They stayed home alone for a week while we went to the beach. For Robert's birthday, I gave him a generic wallet from the dollar store with the tag still on. For Linda's, a candle that smelled like cat pee. They complained to Daniel, and I said I'd put as much thought into their gifts as they'd put into mine for 10 years. When their friends asked to visit, I said the house wasn't ready for guests. They went to Daniel demanding he make me treat them better. What Daniel told them made his mother cry harder. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. I heard Daniel's footsteps on the stairs around 8 that night. He walked past me in the kitchen without speaking and went straight to the small bedroom at the back, where his parents were unpacking their few belongings. I turned off the stove and moved closer to the hallway where I could hear everything. Daniel's voice came through the door, steady and cold in a way I'd never heard in 12 years of marriage. He told them to sit down. I heard the bed creak as they sat. Then he started listing everything I'd documented over 10 years. Every holiday dinner where they'd seated me at the end of their table with mismatched plates. Every family vacation they'd planned and told him about the day before, saying they assumed I'd be too busy. Every Christmas gift with the clearance price tag still attached. Every photo they'd cropped me out of before posting. Linda made a sound like a wounded animal. Daniel kept going. He told them about the day Ben was born, how they'd visited once, complained he didn't look enough like their side and left after 10 minutes. He told them about Amy's birth, how they'd sent him a text but nothing to me, like I was just the vessel that produced their grandchild. Robert tried to interrupt with something about not realizing, about it being different times, about how they'd always welcomed me in their home. Daniel cut him off. He said they'd made me feel invisible. worthless, undeserving of basic human dignity for a decade, and now they were going to understand exactly how that felt. The silence after was thick enough to choke on. I heard Linda crying, then Robert's voice asking if Daniel was really going to let me treat them this way. Daniel said I was treating them exactly the way they'd taught me to treat unwelcome people in my home. I heard him walk to the door and I moved back to the stove before he came out. He didn't look at me as he passed through the kitchen. The next morning, I was at the dining table making breakfast for Ben and Amy when Linda appeared in the doorway. She stood by the kitchen counter where I'd told her to stay unless I invited her further. Her hands twisted together, and her voice shook when she started talking. She said she didn't realize how bad it had been. She said she hoped we could start over, maybe find a way to be a real family. I poured orange juice into Ben's glass, then Amy's, watching the liquid fill each cup to exactly the same level. I set the pitcher down and finally looked at Linda. I told her that 10 years of cruelty doesn't get erased by one uncomfortable conversation. She opened her mouth to say something else, but I turned back to the eggs on the stove. After a minute, I heard her footsteps retreat down the hallway. Robert went to Daniel's home office around noon. I was folding laundry in the bedroom across the hall, and I left my door open so I could hear. Robert's voice had that man-to-man tone, asking Daniel to make me be reasonable. He said they were family, and family forgives. Daniel's response was quiet but clear. He said I was being perfectly reasonable. He said reasonable was exactly what his parents had taught me to be through their example. He said if they didn't like experiencing their own behavior reflected back at them, maybe they should have thought about that before spending a decade making me feel like garbage. Robert said something I couldn't hear, his voice dropping low. Daniel stayed steady. He said they had nowhere else to go and no money to get there, so they were going to stay here and accept whatever treatment I decided they deserved. When Robert came out of the office, he'd aged 20 years. His shoulders curved forward, and his steps were slow and careful, like a man walking on ice. That night, I heard crying from their bedroom. The walls in our house are thin, and I was in the hallway putting away clean towels when Linda's voice carried through the door. She was telling Robert this was worse than losing the house. At least when they lost the house, it was just money and pride. This was watching their son choose his wife over them, watching their grandchildren look at them like strangers, knowing they'd destroyed any chance of a real relationship. Robert's voice was flat when he answered. He said they had nowhere else to go and no money to get there. He said they had to endure whatever I decided to do because the alternative was sleeping in their car. I stood in the hallway with the empty laundry basket and felt something twist in my chest. It felt like vindication, and it felt like being sick at the same time. I went back to the master bedroom and closed the door. Ben asked me at breakfast the next morning why Grandma and Grandpa ate in the living room instead of with us. Amy was pushing cereal around in her bowl, and I saw her eyes flick up to watch me. I told Ben it was complicated. He frowned and said it seemed mean. I changed the subject by asking about his math homework, but his confused expression stayed in my head all day while I was at work. When I came home, Amy was in the living room doing homework, and I caught her watching Linda through the doorway. Linda was sitting on the edge of the TV tray eating something from a paper plate. Amy's face had this look of curious concern, like she was trying to figure out a puzzle. I called her to the kitchen to help with dinner, and she came, but I noticed she kept glancing back. May called that evening while I was cleaning up the kitchen. She asked how things were going with Daniel's parents living here. I gave her the full rundown of my mirrored treatment plan. I told her about the small bedroom with no closet, the mismatched sheets, the TV trays in the living room, the last-minute notifications about family events. I told her about the dollar store gifts. She was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Then she said she understood my anger. She said anyone would be angry after what they'd put me through. But she asked if I'd thought about what happens after the revenge feels satisfying. I told her I'd think about that when the satisfaction actually arrived. She made a humming sound that could have meant anything, and we talked about other things before hanging up. 2 weeks into their stay, Linda tried to help with dinner. I was at the stove browning meat for tacos when she appeared beside me and reached for the cutting board. I told her the kitchen was my space, and she should wait in her room until I called her for meals. She pulled her hand back like she'd touched something hot. She said okay in this small voice and left immediately. I felt Daniel watching me from the doorway to the dining room. When I looked at him, his expression was something I couldn't read. Not angry exactly. Not disappointed. Something else that made me turn back to the stove and focus very hard on stirring the meat. Robert got another rejection email that afternoon. I was walking past their bedroom when I heard him tell Linda that nobody wanted to hire someone his age. His voice had this defeated quality that made me stop in the hallway. Linda asked if they should try Kyle for money. Robert said Kyle already told them his own finances were tight and he couldn't help. Linda started crying again. These quiet sobs that leaked under the door. Robert said something too soft to hear. Their desperation filled the hallway like smoke, and I breathed it in deep. This was the vindication I'd been waiting for. This feeling of them finally understanding what it was like to be powerless and unwanted. I went back to the living room and sat down with my laptop and let that feeling settle in my chest. I planned a family game night for Friday. I set everything up in the living room where Linda and Robert usually ate their dinner. Board games on the coffee table, snacks in bowls, the good throw blankets on the couch. When they came out of their bedroom at 6 expecting to eat, I told them we needed the space tonight. I said they should eat in their bedroom. Linda's face did this thing where understanding finally clicked into place. She looked at the game setup, then at me, then at Daniel and the kids on the couch. She saw that this was going to be her life here. Meals in a bedroom, excluded from family activities, watching through doorways while the real family did things together. She took the paper plates I handed her and went back down the hallway without arguing. Daniel confronted me after we put Ben and Amy to bed. He asked how long I planned to keep this up. I reminded him of every family event his parents had excluded me from. I listed the holidays where I'd sat alone at the end of their table. I detailed every milestone they'd ignored, every cruel comment, every deliberate snub. I asked him where he'd been during all of that. I asked him how many times he'd told me to be patient, to give them time, to understand they were set in their ways. He stood there in our bedroom with his hands in his pockets and didn't have an answer. After a long silence, he got into bed and turned off his lamp. I stayed up another hour scrolling through photos on my phone, looking at all the family pictures they'd cropped me out of over the years. The phone rang Thursday morning while I was unloading the dishwasher. Ben's teacher introduced herself and asked if I had a few minutes to talk about some concerns. My stomach dropped, but I kept my voice steady. She explained that Ben had been quieter than usual in class, not participating in group activities the way he normally did, keeping to himself at recess. She asked if anything had changed at home that might explain the shift in his behavior. I told her everything was fine. We were just adjusting to some family visitors staying with us temporarily. The guilt started creeping up my chest like cold water, but I shoved it down hard. I remembered Linda standing in that hospital room after Ben was born, looking at my newborn son, and complaining he didn't have enough of Daniel's features, like my genes had contaminated him somehow. The teacher said she'd keep monitoring the situation, and suggested I watch for any changes in his mood or behavior at home. I promised I would, and hung up feeling that guilt battle with my anger. 3 weeks had passed since Linda and Robert moved in. I was folding laundry in the living room when Linda appeared in the doorway to the kitchen, where Amy was getting a snack. Linda's voice was soft and careful, as she told Amy she'd seen her dance recital photos on the fridge and thought her form looked really graceful. Amy froze with her hand in the cookie jar and looked at me with this uncertain expression, like she was asking permission to respond. She turned back to Linda and said thank you in this polite but distant voice, then grabbed her cookies and came to sit on the opposite side of the room from where Linda stood. Linda's face did this crumpling thing that lasted just a second before she smoothed it back to neutral. For the first time since they'd moved in, I felt something crack in the satisfaction I'd been carrying around. It wasn't regret exactly, more like the first hint that this revenge might be costing more than I'd calculated. Robert found me in the hallway outside the bathroom on Saturday. He cleared his throat and said he'd noticed the faucet in the guest bathroom had been dripping, and he was pretty handy with that kind of thing from years of maintaining their old house. He offered to fix it for us if I had the tools. I looked at him standing there trying to be useful and told him we had a plumber scheduled to come look at it next week. I added that he should probably focus his energy on job hunting instead of home repairs. Daniel was coming up the stairs with a basket of clean towels, and I saw him stop when he heard my response. Robert nodded slowly and went back to his bedroom without another word. That evening, after the kids were asleep, Daniel came into our bedroom and closed the door behind him. He said what I'd done to his father that afternoon was cruel for no reason. I started listing all the times Robert had been cruel to me, but Daniel cut me off and said he knew. He remembered. But turning away, someone trying to help felt different from the mirrored punishments. We argued for the first time since his parents had moved in, really argued with raised voices that we had to quiet down so the kids wouldn't hear. I found the drawings on Tuesday afternoon. I was putting away Amy's clean clothes in her dresser when I saw the folded papers tucked under her socks. They were simple pencil sketches, flowers and hearts, and stick figures labeled Grandma and Amy. There were notes, too, written in Linda's shaky handwriting telling Amy she loved her and was proud of her. There were similar papers in Ben's room hidden in his desk drawer, drawings of trucks and dinosaurs with notes saying, "Grandpa loves you and you're such a smart boy." My hands shook as I gathered them all up. I found Linda in the small bedroom folding the mismatched towels I'd given her. I dropped the papers on the bed and asked how long she'd been sneaking gifts to my children behind my back. Linda's face went pale and she started crying immediately, these big gasping sobs that made her whole body shake. She said she was trying to be the grandmother she should have been from the start, that she knew she had no right to their love, but she wanted them to know she cared. I told her it was too late for that. 10 years too late. I scooped up all the drawings and notes and took them to my bedroom, shoving them in the back of my closet where the kids couldn't find them. Daniel waited until the kids were in bed that night before he told me we needed to talk. He sat on the edge of our bed and said he thought I'd made my point with his parents, and we needed to find a better way forward for everyone. Something in me exploded. I started listing every single time over 10 years that he'd told me to be patient with Linda and Robert, every excuse he'd made for their behavior, every family event where he'd asked me to just tolerate their treatment for a few more hours. I reminded him of the Easter dinner where his father questioned if Ben was really his child, and Daniel had just changed the subject instead of defending me. I brought up the master's degree graduation he'd convinced me not to make a big deal about because it would make his parents uncomfortable. My voice got louder with each memory until I was almost yelling about how he'd chosen their comfort over my dignity for an entire decade. Daniel sat there taking it and finally admitted he'd failed me, that he should have stood up to them years ago. Then he said 2 wrongs don't make a right and we needed to think about Ben and Amy now. That made me even angrier because he was finally taking a stand now that his parents were the ones suffering, not when I was the one was excluded and humiliated year after year. Ping came over for coffee Wednesday morning. We sat at the kitchen table while Linda and Robert stayed in their bedroom like I'd trained them to do when I had visitors. Ping asked how things were going and I could hear the concern in her voice. She said gently that while my anger was completely valid and understandable, the way I was expressing it might be damaging my kids and my marriage. I got defensive immediately and started detailing the psychological warfare Linda and Robert had waged against me for 10 years. I told her about every cropped photo, every deliberate exclusion, every cruel comment about my children. Ping listened to all of it without interrupting, then said something that made me stop mid-sentence. She said revenge that hurts everyone around you isn't really revenge, it's just spreading the pain to new people. She asked if making Linda and Robert suffer was worth watching my kids become anxious and my marriage strain under the weight of it. I didn't have a good answer for that. Thursday afternoon, I came around the corner from the laundry room and saw Amy in the kitchen bringing Linda a glass of water. Amy was asking if Linda was okay in this sweet, concerned voice that sounded too grown up for a 6-year-old. Linda thanked her and touched her hair gently, and Amy smiled at her grandmother with real warmth. Then Amy saw me standing in the doorway, and her whole body went stiff. The smile disappeared, and she looked scared. Actually scared of my reaction to showing basic kindness to another person. She mumbled something about homework and ran upstairs to her room. Linda and I stood there in the kitchen not looking at each other. That image of my daughter's scared face hit me harder than anything else had in this entire situation. I'd created an environment where my child was afraid to be kind. Ben cornered me in the garage Friday evening while I was taking out the recycling. He asked me straight out why I was being mean to Grandma and Grandpa when they were being nice now. I tried to explain the history, telling him about how they'd treated me before he was born and when he was little. But hearing myself explain adult cruelty to a 10-year-old made it all sound petty and small when spoken out loud. I was telling my son about mismatched plates and cropped photos while his grandparents were living in a storage room and eating meals alone. Ben listened to my explanation, and then said something that felt like a punch to the chest. He said it seemed like I was being the mean one now. I tried to make him understand the context, the years of pain, but he just looked confused and sad. He didn't understand, and maybe he shouldn't have to understand this kind of adult ugliness. Daniel brought up counseling on Saturday morning. He said we needed to work through this situation before it destroyed our family. I refused immediately, saying we didn't need a stranger telling us how to handle his parents. Daniel's voice was steady and determined in a way I wasn't used to hearing from him. He said he was going to counseling with or without me because he needed help navigating between his wife's justified anger and his parents' genuine remorse. He said he couldn't keep being caught in the middle while watching everyone he loved suffer. His determination surprised me enough that I stopped arguing. I told him fine, I'd go, but I wasn't making any promises about changing anything. The therapist's office was in a building downtown with uncomfortable chairs in the waiting room. We sat there not talking until a woman called us back. She had us sit on a couch while she settled into a chair across from us with a notepad. She asked me to start by describing what I wanted as an end goal from the situation. I opened my mouth to answer and realized I hadn't thought past making Linda and Robert suffer. I'd been so focused on revenge that I hadn't considered what came after. When I finally said out loud that I wanted them to suffer the way they'd made me suffer, it sounded hollow and purposeless, even to my own ears. The therapist asked what would actually heal the wound their treatment had created. I sat there on that uncomfortable couch next to my husband and couldn't come up with an answer. I drove home from that counseling session feeling like I'd been turned inside out. The therapist's question kept playing in my head on repeat. What would actually heal the wound their treatment created? I still didn't have an answer when I pulled into the driveway. Linda was waiting on the front porch, standing there with her arms wrapped around herself like she was cold even though it was warm outside. She saw my car and walked down the steps before I even turned off the engine. I got out and she asked if we could talk alone, just the two of us, without Daniel there. I wanted to say no, but something in her face made me agree. We went to the backyard where nobody could hear us through the windows. Linda sat on the bench by the garden and I stayed standing because sitting felt too comfortable. She started talking and her voice was shaking. She told me about her own mother, about how her mother had treated her first husband's wife with cruelty that Linda witnessed as a young woman. She said she swore she'd never be like that, but then Daniel brought me home and she found herself doing the exact same things. She was crying now, tears running down her face that she didn't bother wiping away. She said she had this picture in her head of who Daniel should marry, someone from a specific background with specific qualities, and when I didn't match that picture, she couldn't let it go. She said seeing her own cruelty reflected back at her these past weeks made her finally understand what she'd done to me, how she'd made me feel invisible and worthless in my own family. She looked at me directly and said she knew sorry wasn't enough, that words couldn't undo 10 years of deliberate exclusion and pain. I stood there listening and feeling that familiar anger rise up in my chest. Part of me wanted to tell her it was too late, that she'd had a decade to figure this out and chose cruelty instead. But another part of me, the part that was tired of being angry all the time, knew she was right about one thing. Sorry wasn't enough, but it was something. I told her she was right. That sorry didn't erase anything, but I also admitted something I hadn't wanted to say out loud. I told her that continuing this revenge cycle was poisoning my children and my marriage, that I could see it in Amy's scared face and Ben's confusion. I said I didn't want my kids growing up thinking cruelty was normal family behavior, just because their grandmother had modeled it first. We sat in uncomfortable silence for what felt like forever. The only sound was birds in the trees and a neighbor's lawnmower running somewhere down the street. Finally, I said we needed to establish real boundaries and expectations, instead of me just mirroring her past behavior back at her. I told her that meant actual participation in family life, genuine interest in the grandchildren, respect for me as their mother and Daniel's wife. Linda agreed to whatever I needed, and for the first time her remorse seemed genuine instead of self-pitying. She wasn't crying because she felt bad for herself anymore. She was crying because she finally understood what she'd actually done. Robert appeared from around the side of the house, and I realized he'd been waiting to join us. He walked over slowly like he wasn't sure if he was welcome. He sat down next to Linda on the bench and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. He said he needed to admit something too. He told me he went along with Linda's treatment of me because it was easier than confronting her or looking at his own prejudices about who Daniel should have married. He said he told himself he was just supporting his wife, but really, he was taking the coward's way out. His voice got rough when he talked about watching Ben and Amy be afraid to show him affection, how they'd learned to keep their distance because he'd never been present in their lives. He said he destroyed those relationships before they could even begin, and that was on him, not on Linda, not on me. His accountability felt different from an apology, more real somehow. Daniel came outside then, and I realized he must have been watching from the kitchen window, waiting to see if I needed him. He walked over and stood next to me, not touching but close enough that I could feel his support. I looked at him and said we needed to talk, just us. We went inside to our bedroom and closed the door. For the first time in weeks, we had a real conversation instead of just arguing or avoiding each other. I explained that I needed him to see what his parents' treatment actually looked like from the receiving end, that he'd spent 10 years minimizing and excusing their behavior because confronting them was uncomfortable. Daniel's eyes filled with tears, and he admitted I was right. He said he'd chosen his own comfort over my dignity for years, that his avoidance had enabled their cruelty to continue unchecked. He said watching me mirror their behavior back at them had finally made him understand how deliberate and sustained their exclusion had been. We both cried and agreed we needed to find a path forward that protected our family while acknowledging how complicated this all was. Daniel said he couldn't go back and fix his past failures, but he could do better now. 3 days later, we all went to counseling together, all 4 adults sitting in that office with the uncomfortable chairs. The therapist said we were going to do something difficult, but necessary. She asked Linda and Robert to detail every instance of exclusion they could remember, everything they'd done to make me feel unwelcome over the past 10 years. The list took 40 minutes. Linda started with the mismatched plates at holiday dinners and moved through every cropped photo, every last-minute vacation announcement, every generic gift with the price tag showing. She had to stop multiple times because she was crying too hard to continue. Robert added the things he'd done, the rooms he'd left when I entered, the party for Daniel's promotion where I wasn't invited, the comments about Ben not looking like Daniel enough. Hearing it all spoken out loud in front of a witness made the pattern impossible to deny. The therapist wrote everything down, and when they finally finished, she looked at the pages and pages of notes and said this was systematic exclusion, not just a few thoughtless moments. Then it was my turn. I shared how their treatment made me feel worthless and unwelcome in my own marriage, how I'd dreaded every family event for a decade, how I'd tried so hard to connect with them only to be rejected over and over. I talked about how their rejection of Ben and Amy hurt worse than anything they did to me directly, how watching them ignore my children's milestones and birthdays made me feel like I'd failed to protect my kids from their cruelty. Robert looked genuinely shocked when I talked about the damage to the grandchildren, like he'd actually thought kids wouldn't notice or remember being excluded. The therapist pointed out that children absolutely notice and internalize family dynamics, that Ben and Amy had learned from their grandparents that some people in families don't deserve inclusion or respect. We spent the rest of the session establishing new ground rules. Linda and Robert would get a proper bedroom set up and eat meals with us at the table, but they had to actively participate in family life and show genuine interest in the grandchildren. They were required to keep attending counseling sessions and work seriously on their financial independence, so they could eventually move out. I agreed to stop the mirrored punishment, but I made it clear I was maintaining boundaries about respect and inclusion. The therapist said these were good starting points, and we'd need to check in regularly to make sure everyone was following through. The next family dinner at the table together was awkward and tense. We all sat there making careful, polite conversation with long silences between topics. Amy looked around at everyone and asked if this meant Grandma and Grandpa were staying forever. Linda answered gently that they were working on finding their own place, but they wanted to be part of the family properly while they were here. Ben seemed relieved that the weird tension was easing, even if things weren't perfect yet. He asked Robert to pass the potatoes, and Robert did it with a small smile that looked genuine. Over the next few weeks, Linda started attending Amy's dance classes. She'd sit in the waiting area with the other parents and watch through the window, actually paying attention to Amy's progress instead of just showing up for appearance. Amy was cautious at first, keeping her distance and not making eye contact, but gradually she warmed up when Linda showed consistent interest without trying to buy her affection with gifts or treats. I watched from the sidelines, feeling emotions I couldn't quite name, something between relief that my daughter was getting the grandmother relationship she deserved, and grief that Linda had rejected her at birth and missed so many years. Robert started helping Ben with a school project about family history. I was in the kitchen making dinner when I overheard them in the dining room spreading out papers and photos. Ben asked direct questions about why Robert wasn't around before, why he'd missed birthdays and school events. Robert gave honest, age-appropriate answers about making bad choices and prioritizing the wrong things. He told Ben that he'd let his own ideas about what family should look like get in the way of actually being family, and that was a mistake he was trying to fix now. The accountability in front of his grandson felt significant, like Robert was finally taking real responsibility instead of just apologizing to make himself feel better. I was loading the dishwasher when the doorbell rang 3 days later. May stood on the porch holding a casserole dish and wearing the concerned expression she always got when she thought something was wrong. I let her in, and she walked straight to the kitchen, setting the dish on the counter before turning to really look at me. She studied my face for a long moment and then glanced toward the living room where Linda was helping Amy practice her dance routine. Robert sat on the couch reading a book to Ben, something about dinosaurs based on the pictures I could see from here. May's eyebrows went up and she tilted her head toward the back door. We stepped outside onto the deck where the air was cool and private. She crossed her arms and waited for me to explain what she was clearly seeing as a completely different household than the war zone she'd witnessed before. I told her about the counseling sessions and the new boundaries we'd established, how everyone was trying to function as an actual family instead of me punishing them and them enduring it. She nodded slowly and said I looked different. Less angry maybe, but definitely more tired. I laughed because that was exactly right. The revenge had been simple, straightforward, satisfying in its own twisted way. This messy process of trying to repair something that had been broken for a decade was exhausting and complicated and required constant effort from everyone. But it felt more sustainable, like we were actually building something instead of just tearing each other down. May squeezed my shoulder and said she was proud of me for choosing the harder path, then went back inside to say hello to Linda and Robert like a normal family visit. The following Saturday, Daniel's brother Kyle and May came over for dinner. I'd told Daniel to invite them because I wanted to see how his parents handled a social situation with witnesses who knew the full history. Kyle walked in carrying wine and stopped dead when he saw his parents sitting at our dining table setting out napkins while I stirred pasta sauce at the stove. His mouth actually fell open, and he looked at Daniel with complete confusion. Linda greeted him warmly and asked about his week at work. Robert stood up to shake his hand and asked if he wanted a beer. Kyle accepted the beer but kept glancing between his parents and me like he was waiting for someone to start yelling. Dinner was almost normal, with conversation about Kyle's job and May's pottery classes and Ben's upcoming science fair project. Amy showed everyone her latest dance moves, and both Linda and Robert clapped and praised her without any of the fake enthusiasm from before. After we finished eating, Kyle pulled Daniel aside into the home office. I was clearing plates when I saw them through the doorway having an intense whispered conversation. Later that night, after Kyle and May left, Daniel told me Kyle had asked if I'd forgiven his parents. Daniel explained that it wasn't about forgiveness. It was about establishing functional family dynamics that didn't hurt our kids or destroy our marriage. Kyle admitted he'd avoided the whole situation for years because dealing with their parents' behavior toward me made him too uncomfortable, so he just pretended not to notice. The fact that Kyle could acknowledge that felt like progress, even if it was years too late. On Tuesday afternoon, Linda approached me while I was folding laundry in the living room. She asked if she could take Amy shopping for new dance supplies, just the two of them. My entire body went tense, and I felt that familiar suspicion flood through me. This was exactly the kind of thing where Linda could undermine me, badmouth me to my daughter, try to turn Amy against me the way she'd tried to turn Daniel against me for years. I opened my mouth to say no, but Daniel walked in from the garage and caught the tail end of the conversation. He looked at me with that expression that meant he was asking me to trust the process we'd started. I told Linda she could take Amy, but I was absolutely clear about the terms. If she said one negative thing about me, if she tried to make herself look like the victim, if she undermined my parenting or my authority in any way, she would be out of our house permanently and would never see the grandchildren again. Linda's face went pale, but she nodded and said she understood and would respect those boundaries completely. They left an hour later with Amy chattering excitedly about the new dance bag she wanted. I spent the entire 2 hours they were gone, cleaning the kitchen with more force than necessary, and checking my phone every few minutes. When they returned, Amy ran in holding shopping bags and hugged me, talking rapidly about the supplies they'd picked out, and how Grandma let her choose everything herself. I pulled Linda aside while Amy showed Daniel her new things and asked directly if she'd said anything inappropriate. Linda looked me in the eye and said she'd talked about dance and Amy's favorite colors and what snacks she liked. Nothing more. Amy seemed genuinely happy and not confused or upset, which I took as a good sign. Thursday evening, Robert came home from somewhere looking exhausted but carrying himself differently than usual. He'd been gone most of the day, and I'd assumed he was at another job interview that would end in rejection like all the others. Instead, he came into the kitchen where I was starting dinner and told me he'd gotten a part-time job at the hardware store on Main Street. It wasn't the executive position he was used to, wasn't anywhere close to the salary and status he'd had before, but it was honest work that would give him purpose and let him contribute to household expenses. He looked genuinely proud despite the obvious exhaustion on his face. I acknowledged his effort and told him that was good, that contributing was important. He thanked me for giving him the chance to prove himself, for not just throwing him out when he'd treated me so badly for so long. His voice cracked a little when he said it, and I realized this was the first time he'd thanked me for something, without it feeling like manipulation or obligation. It felt like a real shift, like he actually understood what he was being given and why it mattered. Our next counseling session, the therapist asked if I was ready to hear Linda and Robert's perspective on why they'd treated me the way they did. Every muscle in my body resisted that question. I didn't want to hear their excuses or justifications or whatever story they'd tell themselves to make their cruelty seem reasonable. But Daniel reached over and took my hand, and I remembered we were trying to build something functional here, not just maintain battle lines. I said I was ready, even though I wasn't sure that was true. Linda took a shaky breath and explained she'd had rigid ideas about who Daniel should marry, some fantasy daughter-in-law who matched her exact specifications. When I didn't match that fantasy, she couldn't accept it, couldn't let go of what she'd imagined, and embrace the reality of who Daniel actually chose. She'd convinced herself that if she made me uncomfortable enough, I'd eventually leave and Daniel would find someone more suitable. Robert admitted he'd always been conflict avoidant, that he went along with Linda's treatment of me because confronting her or examining his own prejudices was too hard. He took the path of least resistance even when he knew it was wrong, and he was ashamed of that cowardice now. I sat with their explanations for a long minute before responding. I told them that understanding their motivations didn't erase the damage they'd caused or make the past decade hurt any less. But it did help me see them as flawed people who made terrible choices rather than monsters who'd intentionally set out to destroy me. That distinction mattered somehow, made the whole thing feel less personal, even though it had been deeply personal. The therapist said this was progress toward coexistence, if not full reconciliation, that seeing each other as complex humans rather than villains or victims was important for moving forward. Linda asked what she could actually do to make real amends, how she could prove this wasn't just words. I told her the only thing that mattered was consistent changed behavior over time. Not grand gestures or dramatic apologies, just day after day of treating me and my children with genuine respect and care. She nodded and said she could do that. Would do that for however long it took. The following week, Ben's teacher called again. This time her tone was completely different from the concerned call I'd gotten before. She said Ben's mood had improved significantly, and he seemed much more settled at the school. His focus was better. He was participating in class discussions again, and he'd stopped that withdrawn behavior that had worried her. I thanked her for letting me know and hung up, feeling that complicated mix of relief and guilt. The household tension had been affecting him more than I'd wanted to admit. I'd told myself the kids were resilient, that they didn't fully understand what was happening, but clearly Ben had absorbed every bit of the anger and dysfunction. Creating stability, even if it was imperfect, was better for my kids than maintaining my revenge. That realization felt like losing something, like giving up a weapon I'd earned the right to use. But it also felt like choosing my children's well-being over my own justified anger. And when I put it that way, the choice seemed obvious, even if it hurt. Saturday morning, Amy came into the kitchen holding markers and construction paper. She asked if she could make Grandma a birthday card because Linda's birthday was next week. My first instinct was immediate and sharp. That automatic no that came from years of protecting myself and my kids from Linda's rejection. But I looked at Amy's hopeful face and thought about all the therapy sessions and boundary conversations and the slow, painful progress we'd been making. Instead of saying no, I sat down at the table with her and helped her make the card. We drew flowers and butterflies, and Amy wrote her name in careful letters at the bottom. When she gave it to Linda that evening, Linda started crying and pulled Amy into a hug. I stood in the doorway watching someone who'd hurt me deeply receive kindness from my daughter, and that familiar discomfort settled in my chest. Daniel came up behind me and squeezed my hand. He didn't say anything, but I knew he understood how hard this was, how much effort it took to allow these moments instead of blocking them out of spite. 2 weeks later, Ping called and invited our whole family to dinner at her and Wei's house. She specifically said Linda and Robert were included in the invitation. It would be the first time we'd socialized as a complete family unit outside our own home, the first time other people would see us functioning together. I agreed, but felt anxious about it all week. The dinner itself was surprisingly functional, if not exactly comfortable. Wei told a story about his own difficult family dynamics, how his parents had disapproved of Ping initially, and how they'd worked through it with time and firm boundaries. He said the key was consistency, and not accepting behavior that crossed lines even when it was family doing the crossing. Hearing someone else validate that approach made me feel less alone in this messy process. After dinner, Linda pulled me aside into Ping's kitchen while everyone else was in the living room. She thanked me for not giving up on the possibility of functional family relationships. She said she knew she didn't deserve my grace, but she was grateful for it. That having a chance to know her grandchildren and be part of their lives was more than she'd thought she'd get after everything she'd done. I looked at her directly and told her I wasn't doing this for her sake. I was doing it for my kids who deserved grandparents and for my marriage, which couldn't survive continued warfare. That was honest, even if it wasn't warm. And Linda nodded like she understood that was the best she was going to get right now. 5 months after they moved in, Robert came home from his hardware store shift and asked if we could all sit down together. Linda was already at the kitchen table with Daniel when I walked in from picking up the kids from the school. Robert cleared his throat and said they'd been saving every penny from his paychecks and Linda's part-time cashier job at the grocery store. They had enough now for a security deposit and first month's rent on a small apartment about 15 minutes away. Linda added quickly that they weren't leaving because things were bad, but because having their own space would be healthier for everyone. I nodded and said that made sense, feeling a weird mix of relief and something else I couldn't name. Ben looked up from his homework at the kitchen counter and asked if Grandma and Grandpa were moving far away. Robert told him they'd still see each other all the time, just not living in the same house. Amy's face fell and she asked if she did something wrong. Linda got up and hugged her, saying they loved living with us, but grown-ups sometimes need their own space. That night after the kids went to bed, I sat on the back porch thinking about how different this felt from when they first arrived. Back then, I would have celebrated them leaving. Now I felt something closer to sadness mixed with the relief, which annoyed me because I didn't want to feel sad about people who'd hurt me so badly. The moving day came on a Saturday morning. Daniel rented a truck and we all helped load their stuff, which wasn't much since they'd lost most of their belongings when they lost their house. The apartment was in an older building but clean, with 2 bedrooms and a small living area. Linda walked through it with this careful expression, like she was trying not to show too much emotion either way. Robert carried boxes up the stairs, and I noticed how much older he looked than when they'd first moved in, like the humility of the past months had aged him. Ben and Amy ran around exploring while we unpacked, and Amy discovered the second bedroom had a window seat. Linda knelt down next to her and said that could be Amy's special spot when she visited, if that was okay with me. She looked right at me when she said it, asking permission instead of assuming. I told her the kids could have sleepovers once we established some ground rules. Linda's whole face changed, and she thanked me 3 times in a row. We spent the afternoon setting up furniture and hanging curtains, and it felt weirdly normal, like we were actually family helping family. Robert ordered pizza for everyone, and we ate sitting on their new couch with paper plates. Ben asked when they could come back and visit the apartment, and Daniel said we'd figure out a schedule that worked for everyone. On the drive home, Amy fell asleep in her car seat, and Ben stared out the window quietly. Daniel reached over and squeezed my hand without saying anything. The first overnight visit was 2 weeks later on a Friday night. I packed the kids' bags with their pajamas, toothbrushes, and specific instructions written on a list for Linda about bedtimes, food restrictions, and emergency contacts. Linda took the list seriously and read through it twice, promising to follow everything exactly. I kissed Ben and Amy goodbye and watched them walk up to the apartment building with their little backpacks. The house felt too quiet that night. I checked my phone every 20 minutes, even though Linda had texted right away that they'd arrived safely. Daniel found me staring at my phone at 10 o'clock and reminded me that his parents had been doing really well for months now. I knew he was right, but couldn't shake the anxiety that something would go wrong. Around midnight, I finally fell asleep, and when I woke up the next morning, the first thing I did was check my phone. Linda had sent a photo of Ben and Amy eating pancakes at her little kitchen table, both smiling. I drove over to pick them up at 9 like we'd agreed, and when Linda opened the door, both kids ran to hug me, talking over each other about the fun they'd had. Linda handed me a folder with notes about what they'd eaten, when they'd gone to bed, and how the night had gone. Every single one of my instructions had been followed perfectly. She didn't ask for praise or acknowledgement, just wanted me to have the information. On the drive home, Ben told me Grandpa had taught him a card game, and Grandma had let them help make breakfast. Amy said she liked sleeping in the room with the window seat. That night I texted Linda, thanking her for respecting the boundaries, and she responded immediately saying she was grateful for the chance. Our final scheduled counseling session happened the following week. The therapist had been seeing us weekly for months and said this would be our last required appointment unless we wanted to continue. She asked each of us what we'd learned from this whole process. Robert went first and talked about how he'd spent his whole life avoiding conflict and going along with whatever was easiest, and that passivity had enabled real cruelty towards someone who didn't deserve it. Linda spoke next, and her voice shook when she said she'd learned that her own insecurities and rigid expectations had caused genuine damage to her family, and that changing behavior was harder, but more important, than just apologizing. Daniel admitted he'd been a coward for years, making excuses and avoiding confrontation because dealing with the tension was uncomfortable, and his avoidance had left me alone to endure treatment no one should tolerate. When it was my turn, I said I'd learned that revenge feels satisfying at first, but doesn't actually heal anything, and that my children's well-being and my marriage mattered more than my completely justified anger. The therapist nodded and said we'd done hard work that most families never attempt. She reminded us that progress isn't linear and we'd probably have setbacks, but we'd built tools to handle them. Linda asked if we could still call her if issues came up, and the therapist said absolutely. Her door was always open. Walking out to the parking lot afterward felt different from walking in had months ago. Robert shook Daniel's hand, and Linda hugged me carefully, like she was still learning the boundaries of physical affection with me. Kyle called me the next day and asked if he could come over to talk privately. He showed up that evening after the kids were in bed, looking uncomfortable. We sat in the living room, and he apologized for never standing up for me during all those years his parents excluded me from family events. He said he'd witnessed their treatment and stayed silent because confronting them seemed too hard, and watching this whole process had made him realize his silence was complicity. I appreciated him saying it, even though it didn't change the past. He asked how I'd managed to move from the revenge phase to something more functional, and I told him honestly that it wasn't a clean transition, that some days I still wanted to punish Linda and Robert for the years they stole, but mostly I was just tired and wanted peace for my kids. Kyle said he and May wanted to do better going forward, wanted to build a family dynamic where people actually stood up for each other. We agreed to try to. He promised that if his parents ever slipped back into old patterns, he wouldn't stay quiet this time. After he left, I felt something shift, like maybe the extended family could actually function if everyone committed to the work. Linda called a few weeks later and asked if she could host Thanksgiving at her apartment for the whole family. My first reaction was an automatic no, that instinct to refuse anything she asked for. But Daniel heard the conversation and later encouraged me to think of it as a test of whether the new normal could hold. I called her back and said yes with one clear condition, that if she reverted to any of her old exclusionary behaviors, we would leave immediately, and she'd lose time with the grandchildren. Linda agreed without hesitation, and said she understood completely. The weeks leading up to Thanksgiving, I felt anxious about it. Ping called to check in, and I told her my concerns about whether Linda could actually host an inclusive family dinner after years of excluding me. Ping reminded me that Linda had been consistently different for months now, and that I could leave any time if things went badly. That helped a little. Thanksgiving Day arrived, and we drove to Linda's apartment with dishes I'd made to contribute. Kyle and May were already there when we arrived, and the small space was crowded but warm. Linda had set the table carefully with matching plates, and everyone had a name card at their spot. Mine was in crayon with hearts around it saying Amy's Mommy in Amy's handwriting. Linda saw me looking at it, and her eyes filled with tears. She came over and thanked me quietly for giving them this chance, for not writing them off completely. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. Robert helped Ben and Amy make the place cards that morning, Linda explained, and they'd been so excited about it. The dinner itself was surprisingly okay. Linda made a point of including me in every conversation, asking my opinion on things and making sure I felt comfortable. Robert told stories that actually made everyone laugh, and I caught myself almost enjoying it before remembering to stay guarded. After we ate, the kids played cards with Robert while the adults cleaned up. Linda worked next to me at the sink washing dishes and said she knew this didn't erase anything, but she hoped it showed she was trying. I told her actions over time mattered more than words, and she said she understood that. May called me a few days after Thanksgiving and said she was proud of how I'd handled everything. She said watching me validate my own pain, while still choosing the harder path of boundaries instead of continued revenge, took real strength. I admitted that some days I still wanted to punish Linda and Robert for the years they stole from me, but most days I was just tired and wanted peace. May said that was probably healthier than either keeping the rage burning or pretending everything was fine. We talked about how messy real healing was compared to how people imagined it should go. She asked if I felt like I'd forgiven them, and I said no. Forgiveness felt too big and too simple for what actually happened. What I felt was more like acceptance that they were trying to be different people now, and choosing to allow that for my kids' sake. May said that was probably more honest than forgiveness anyway. 6 months after we'd established the new boundaries and ground rules, an envelope arrived in the mail addressed to me in Linda's handwriting. Inside was a letter, pages long, detailing every specific incident she could remember where she'd excluded me or hurt me. The list was thorough and painful to read. Next to each incident, she'd written a genuine apology explaining why that particular action was cruel and what she should have done instead. She didn't ask for forgiveness anywhere in the letter. The last paragraph just said she needed me to know she saw exactly what she'd done, that she understood the full scope of her cruelty, and that she was committed to being different going forward. I read it 3 times, and then put it in my desk drawer. I didn't respond right away because I needed time to process seeing all those years of hurt acknowledged in writing. Daniel found me crying in our bedroom that night and held me while I told him about the letter. He said his mother was really trying, and I said I knew that, but it didn't make the past hurt less. 2 weeks later, Daniel arranged a date night for just the 2 of us. The first one in months where his parents weren't the main topic of conversation. We went to dinner at a restaurant we used to love before everything got complicated. Halfway through the meal, Daniel reached across the table and took my hand. He told me he was amazed by my strength in choosing the harder path of boundaries and functional relationships over the simpler satisfaction of continued revenge. He said watching me parent through this impossible situation while protecting our kids and trying to heal our family had made him love me more, not less. I started crying right there in the restaurant. I told him I didn't feel strong most of the time, just exhausted and confused about whether I was doing the right thing. He said that was probably what real strength looked like, doing the hard thing even when you weren't sure, choosing your family's well-being over your own justified anger. We sat there holding hands across the table, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not peace exactly, but maybe the beginning of it. Amy's recital night arrived, and I sat in the auditorium watching parents file in with cameras and flowers. Linda and Robert came through the door together, Linda carrying a bouquet of pink roses that matched Amy's costume. They sat 3 rows ahead of us, and I watched Robert lean forward in his seat when the lights dimmed, actually paying attention instead of checking his phone. Amy twirled across the stage in her butterfly costume, and Linda clapped so hard her hands must have hurt. After the performance ended, Linda found us in the lobby and asked if she could take a photo with Amy. She looked directly at me and said she'd really like me to be in it too, if that was okay. We stood together while Daniel took the picture, Linda's arm around Amy and my hand on my daughter's shoulder, and something about seeing myself included in that moment made my throat tight. Ben came home from the school the next week, talking about how Robert had been teaching him to use tools in the garage. He showed me a small wooden box he'd made, sanded smooth and stained dark brown, and said Robert had helped him measure and cut every piece. I held that box in my hands and felt happiness that my son had this relationship mixed with grief. So sharp it made my chest ache. Daniel found me staring at the box later and wrapped his arms around me from behind. He reminded me we couldn't change the past, but we were building something better now, and I leaned back against him because I needed to believe that was true. 7 months had passed since Linda and Robert moved in, and our family had found a rhythm that worked even if it wasn't perfect. We ate dinner together every Wednesday. The kids spent Saturday afternoons with their grandparents, and conversations happened without the careful tension that used to fill every room. The marriage counselor told us during our session that we'd done remarkable work and could move to monthly check-ins instead of weekly ones. I felt cautiously hopeful about maintaining this balance, like maybe we'd actually figured out how to be a functional family despite everything. I finally wrote back to Linda about her letter. I told her I'd received it, and that seeing her write out every specific incident mattered to me, because it meant she really understood what she'd done. I didn't say I forgave her because I wasn't there yet and might never be, but I wrote that I appreciated her genuine effort to change and be the grandmother my children deserved. She responded 3 days later with just a thank you and nothing else. No requests for more or demands that I say I forgave her, which felt like she'd actually learned something about respecting my boundaries. Robert came home from work 2 weeks later looking different, standing taller than usual. He'd been promoted to assistant manager at the hardware store and wanted to take the family out to dinner to celebrate. We went to a steakhouse near the mall, and Robert ordered appetizers for the table, making sure to ask what everyone wanted. He stood up before dessert came and thanked me for giving him a place to land when he had nothing. He said the experience of losing everything and having to rebuild taught him things about humility that his executive career never did. The gratitude in his voice sounded genuine, and I nodded at him across the table, accepting what he offered without needing to say more. Kyle and May invited us over for Sunday brunch and announced they were expecting a baby due in January. Linda's face lit up immediately. Then she looked at me nervously, like she was asking permission to be excited. I told her congratulations and that I hoped she'd learned from her mistakes with Ben and Amy. She promised she'd be a better grandmother this time, that she'd do everything right from the start, and I believed her, because she'd proven over 7 months that people could actually change if they worked hard enough at it. Ben cornered me in the kitchen while I was making his lunch for school. He asked directly if I'd forgiven Grandma and Grandpa for being mean before. I stopped spreading peanut butter and told him honestly that forgiveness was complicated and I was still working on it, but I'd chosen to let them be part of our family because they were trying hard to be better. He seemed satisfied with that answer and said he was glad they were around now because Robert was teaching him cool stuff and Linda always had good snacks. His simple acceptance of the messy reality made me smile, despite the weight of everything else. We had a family barbecue at our house in early September with the weather still warm enough to eat outside. I stood by the grill flipping burgers and watched Linda and Robert playing tag with Ben and Amy in the yard. Robert caught my eye across the lawn and mouthed, "Thank you." And I nodded back because while I'd never forget the decade of cruelty, I could see they were genuinely trying to be different people now. Daniel wrapped his arm around my waist and we stood there together, watching our imperfect but functional family, and he kissed the side of my head without saying anything because sometimes there weren't words for complicated feelings. The marriage counselor scheduled a final check-in session to assess our progress. She asked if I felt the situation was resolved, and I said no. It wasn't resolved because you can't resolve a decade of damage in 7 months. But it was managed and sustainable, which felt like the best I could hope for. The therapist nodded and said that was actually the healthiest possible outcome. Not pretending the past didn't happen, but building functional relationships despite it. She said most families never get this far, and we should be proud of the work we'd done. Ping came over for coffee the next afternoon and asked how I really felt about everything now that things had stabilized. I admitted I still had anger that flared up sometimes when I remembered specific incidents, like Linda's comment about hoping Ben wouldn't look like me or Robert questioning his paternity. But mostly, I felt tired relief that the active conflict was over and we could just be a family without constant tension. Ping said healing wasn't straight, and I was allowed to have complicated feelings about people who hurt me deeply even if they'd changed, and hearing her say that made me feel less guilty about not being able to forgive completely. Linda caught me in the kitchen one Saturday morning while I was making pancakes for the kids. She asked if she could take Amy to get her ears pierced, something Amy had been begging me about for months. My first reaction was to say no just because Linda was asking, but I stopped myself and actually thought about it. Amy was old enough and it was a normal grandmother thing to do. I told Linda yes, but that I was coming with them. We went to the mall that afternoon. All 3 of us and Linda paid for the piercing and picked out little silver studs with Amy. Watching them together in the mirror, Amy excited and Linda genuinely engaged, felt like what grandparents and grandchildren were supposed to look like. Progress didn't look like I'd imagined, but it was still progress. 8 months after Robert and Linda moved in, Daniel told me one night after the kids went to bed that he was proud of how I'd handled everything. I laughed and said there was nothing graceful about the revenge phase, when I deliberately made them miserable. He said even that was understandable given what I'd endured for 10 years. We talked for over an hour about how we were both doing better at communicating, at supporting each other through the mess of family relationships. Robert and Linda invited everyone to their apartment for dinner a few weeks later. They'd set up the small space nicely, and Linda had cooked a full meal. Kyle and May came with their growing baby bump, and Ping and Wei showed up with wine. Linda made a point of introducing me as her daughter-in-law and Ben and Amy's mother, using my name over and over in every conversation. She included me in discussions, asked my opinion on things, made sure I felt part of everything. The deliberate inclusion felt like she was trying to make up for all those years of exclusion, and while it didn't erase the past, it acknowledged what had happened. We drove home that night with Ben and Amy talking nonstop about their grandparents' apartment and the games Robert taught them. I looked at Daniel's profile in the driver's seat and realized we'd built something that worked even if it wasn't perfect. The decade of pain couldn't be erased, and I'd probably always carry anger about those lost years and missed moments. But my children had grandparents who loved them now, and my marriage was stronger for surviving the storm. Daniel reached over and squeezed my hand without taking his eyes off the road. I squeezed back, holding on to what we'd chosen together, the messy work of family over the temporary satisfaction of revenge.